Morning. You know, it was getting to be 10:25. I was looking around the room like, oh my goodness, we hardly have anyone here. And now I get up and it's full. You know how that happens. Well, good morning. I see our regulars and I see some newcomers, and we are just so grateful to have all of you here this morning. I am Rev Cindy Grimes. Most of you know that already. Is this okay here, Center? Very good. All right. Well, this morning, I love the aha moment. Anybody else like when they get an aha moment? I love that. And this topic that I'm talking about this morning has been a great aha moment for me. It is one of my favorite things to talk about. And it happens to be the very basis of what we teach here in Centers for Spiritual Living, in this teaching of the science of mind. So I'm super excited about this. Has anyone noticed that there's kind of a great debate going on in our country? Seems like it has been for a while, between religion and science? Anyone notice that? Okay. I come from a very large family, a large Catholic family, and I can tell you about half of them are very Catholic, and there's a whole group of atheists. My brother happens to be one of them, so imagine for my parents, they've got a minister and an atheist. But it's just part of what is going on in the national culture. You know, we've got religion and science, and they call it the Great Rift. It really has been a great divide in our country, and it continues on. But I will tell you that it has not always been this way. And I'm going to run through kind of the timeline of this situation. You see, for most of recorded history, for most of the time that man has actually written things down, there was never a divide. People who were the great thinkers of their day, from the ancient Greeks on, lots of them were theologians, they were philosophers, and they were scientists all at the same time. Everyone looking for answers to the meaning of life. Why is it that we're here? What is it that we are here to do? Looking for those answers, and they found it. It was all in all three of those things. So the ancient Greeks started it. Aristotle, we do not know a truth without knowing its cause. It was just, that's what they were about, is to understand the nature of the universe. Then we had what was called the Islamic Golden Age. The Muslims back in the 8th through 13th century were actually tremendous scientists. They were the ones who actually started the scientific method, where there would be observation, and then people would make a hypothesis, and they would do experiments and make predictions and so on, a whole process that we still use today. And then things started to change a little bit. Anybody know the name Copernicus? All right. So what happened with Copernicus was Copernicus had the gall to say that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Yeah. And the theologians said, oh, that cannot be. However, in his day, he wasn't punished for this belief. It was just something about 60 years after the church said, oh, no, we don't believe that. We don't buy into that. Then there was another gentleman by the name of Giordano Bruno. And Giordano Bruno was also, I believe he was a priest as well. He was a monk. And he expanded on the work of Copernicus. And his punishment for doing that, for suggesting again that the earth was not the center of the universe, and that God is in and through nature, and nature is part of God, what he suffered for that belief was being burned at the stake. That was a time we call the Dark Ages. And then we have Galileo Galilei, who also continued on with that proving that we are not, in fact, the center of the universe, but that the earth revolves around the sun. And Galileo was, his work was considered the beginning of modern science. But that's where the split started to happen. It was just a little bit of a split. Then it got a little wider. If you've heard the name Descartes, anybody know the name Descartes? And what Descartes started preaching was that there is matter and there is spirit, that they are two separate things. Matter being dumb, inert, right? Like rocks, basically. And then there was spirit. But those two were very separate things. And so we live today with this idea that mind and body are very separate things. And that's where that started. And then it continued on. Sir Isaac Newton, who shared the mathematical principles behind the movement of objects. He is considered the father of modern science. Now, he still believed in God. In fact, he felt like God put all of the pieces in motion, that God was the power behind the science that was causing this, that, and the other. But somehow, people kind of left out that part. And then that divide became like a chasm, a canyon with who? Darwin, with Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. Now that was about 150 years ago, and we are still dealing with the repercussions of that, which is where we are now in our time of this huge divide between science and religion, and this idea that you're either with us or you're against us. That you can't possibly believe both. Now we, of course, have a different idea in mind. But here I want you to really get what the consequences have been of this. Because religion without science breeds superstition, ignorance, and fanaticism. Right? Are you familiar with these guys? The Westboro Baptist Church, I don't know if you can read those signs. God is not your friend. You're not blessed. God hates you. You're going to hell. These are the guys that protest at military funerals and things because they don't like homosexuality. You guys know who I'm talking about. And then on the other end of things, we have the ISIS and fanatics. I mean, just all over the world now, it seems. It's scary time. Scary times we're dealing with. So that's what happens when you have religion without the basis of science. On the other side of the equation, we have science without religion, without meaning, where the only thing that is important is materiality and what we can observe and what we can measure and what we can experiment with and what we can see, right? Can we see spirit? Can we measure spirit? Well, see, in scientific realms, therefore, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because they can't quantify it. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more in coming weeks, but the idea with science, with material, and I don't mean materiality as far as just owning stuff and having lots of money. What I mean as a philosophical, as a scientific idea, is this thing that we can always break the whole down into smaller and smaller parts. So you've got a human being who's made up of different organs. Well, those organs are made up of cells, and those cells are made up of molecules, and those molecules are made up of atoms, and those atoms are made up of elementary particles. And if you keep cutting things back and cutting things back, what do you find? Nobody knows. They're thinking now that what we find when we get all the way down is consciousness, but science can't experiment with that, so they disregard that. They don't want to talk about that. So all they can talk about, all that they can deal with and study is this materiality. So what happens is we've got meaningless people who are, well, I'll show you. Fundamentalism, whether it's having to do with science or having to do with religion, fosters this idea of us being completely separate. Separate from one another, separate from our environment, separate from God. Even separation within ourselves. Right? Your mind and your body, like they're two different things. And what's the result of that? On the smallest end, I will say that it causes people to be indifferent, like not caring. Now, Grady and I were driving home from Fort Lauderdale yesterday, and in front of us, somebody just throws their trash right out the window. We're talking like we live in paradise here, and people have the nerve to throw their crap out the window like it doesn't matter. But if you don't think it matters, well, this is garbage in my car, so why not toss it, right? What do I care? It's not hurting me. My car is clean now, right? Because they don't care about the effects and what's happening, what it does for other people. So a feeling of indifference, because I'm separate from you, you're separate from me, what does it matter? And then we survival of the fittest, right? That's what we're all about, survival of the fittest. So we have people who are indifferent to what is going on around them and the environment. We have people who are feeling disconnected from other people. They don't feel that sense of belonging and like they're here for some kind of purpose. So what happens? We've got all these different addictions. I mean, go through the list. The addictions to computer, to Facebook, to food, to alcohol, to drugs, to gambling, to pornography. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You know, did you ever stop to think that alcohol is called spirits? You ever think about that, right? So people who are going to the bottle are trying to refuel their spirit, right, because of this sense of separation. Then it starts to get more intense here, because we're talking about people who are no longer just indifferent. Now we're talking about people who are afraid, people who are angry, people who are thinking, you know, all about self-preservation. It's all about me. Right? It's all about me, or it's about survival of the fittest. Therefore, if I can beat you down, then I rise to the top. And what does it matter, because you were less than anyway? Right? So it just, here we've got the bullying that we see. And at its very worst, war. See, because if people believed, or if they felt like we were connected, they could not do these atrocities to another human being. If I felt like what I do to you has a direct effect on me, I'm going to treat you pretty good. Don't you think? I mean, I was just hearing little murmurs. We were on the road all night last night, and was there a massacre in Orlando? You know, yesterday, right? This is this morning then. 50 people. The number's been going up, apparently. The number keeps going up. You know, if you look at these outward signs, what we're seeing in the world is a result of this feeling of disconnection and separation that we're seeing. It's kind of depressing, isn't it? It's scary. It's frightening. It's a lot of things, right? And I don't mean to bring you down. In fact, I'm not going to, because I feel like in our teaching, we have an answer to this. Oh, I had to throw that one in there. The devil made me do it. Because that fundamentalism, you know, another way that it fosters this separation is that, well, it's not me doing it. The devil made me do it. Right? Because we're separate. I want to make sure I get all of these points. I had so much cool stuff for you. So the scope, the problem is large. The problem is large. It has been, and it looks like we're headed toward destruction, whether it's through environmental degradation or what we're doing to one another, you know, in terms of war and just violence and not caring. But we have science of mind. There is something happening. There is a shift that is happening scientifically. See what's happening in science now. We've got, within the past 50 years, maybe a little more, quantum science, which is actually starting to prove what the mystics have been saying all along. That there is this realm where we are all one, this realm of infinite potentiality. You know, when you keep cutting the atoms back and see what they're all about, you get to this place of just really an infinite possibility where everything comes from that space. And this is what the mystics have been saying for years, for millennia. They have been saying this. And I found this quote. This is actually, believe it or not, the very first sentence in the Science of Mind textbook. It is the first thing Ernest Holmes says. We all look forward to the day when science and religion shall walk hand in hand through the visible to the invisible. That is what this teaching is based on, is this idea of healing the rift between science and religion. And by healing, we don't mean that it's fixing something, because it was never broken to begin with. What we're fixing here is our understanding and our realization of the oneness. Our lack of belief or our lack of understanding doesn't change the fact that that's what it is. Right? I've said this before. You may not believe in gravity. You may not like it. It sounds ridiculous, right? But we're still subject to the effects of it. The same thing, oneness. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, or whether you like it or you buy into it. It doesn't matter. It exists. So when we talk about healing, what we're doing is we're changing our perspective to be more in line with the truth of being. Okay, so that's what healing means in our teaching. And that's what we're talking about in healing this rift between science and religion. Is part of what we're here to do in this teaching, and this is what makes me so excited about this, is we are on the edge right now of a paradigm shift. You all know what a paradigm shift is, right? We're talking about the magnitude when the earth went from being flat in people's perception to realizing that it was round and you could actually travel from one place to another without falling off the edge of the planet. It seems silly now, right? There is going to be a time, and I don't know if it will be in our lifetime, it may not, where people look back on us and on centuries prior and say, you know, they believed that everything was separate, right? That we were somehow disconnected, that the body and mind were two different things, that the body was just a machine. Can you believe that? People thought that way, and that's how they're going to look at us. Like, oh, they were so cute. They may say that. I don't. So, how do we know this stuff? And this was a great aha moment for me, in that how is it that we know what we know? This is, for me, the starting point for us to go forward in the rest of this conversation of how we investigate oneness and the three-part nature of man and all these other wonderful things that we teach here in Centers for Spiritual Living. So how do we know? Because we're talking about the study, essentially, this oneness that we're talking about can also be looked at or called consciousness. It seems some of the scientist, I can't think of what his name was, it says when you keep cutting back and going back smaller and smaller and smaller, what you find out is like the universe is really more like a great thought than anything else. So it's what we are at our basis. Consciousness is what, it's kind of a bottom up, they call it. Everything starts in consciousness, and then you get to the material realm and so on and so forth. Rather than, as materialists believe, that the mind is an emanation of the brain, right? It's an increasing complexity. So you've got atoms, they become molecules, as I said, then those come together and become cells, and cells become organs, like the brain. And then consciousness somehow magically comes out of the brain. That's what materialists would have you believe. That's what they believe, because they can't prove it going the other way, or they haven't been able to until very recently. So how is it that we know what we know? There are 4 ways of knowing, the ways that we investigate consciousness and the universe around us. The first way of knowing, think about it, is scientific knowing. And what do I mean by that? By scientific knowing. That is what we know through the use of our senses and through observation. So you see with your eyes, you can hear things, you can feel things. That's how we get to know the universe around us. Now, the problem with just purely scientific knowing is that we are limited by our senses, right? You know that your heart's beating now, but you can't hear it unless you get really quiet. So we use instruments, and our instruments act as an extension of our senses. And that's what science is based on. However, there are things, for example, my husband has no sense of smell. I think I've said this. Some of you may know that. I have a very keen sense of smell. And I often wonder if everyone else was like Grady and I'm like me, can smell things, and I can walk in a room and say, oh, the garbage needs to be thrown out. He's like, really? How do you know that? Well, it's because we have different, our senses work differently. So we're limited by our senses. If you just went by your senses, then the early church would have been right, because it does look like the sun is moving. It feels like the earth is stationary. Our senses tell us that the earth is stationary. But of course we know that it's not. So your senses can't always be trusted, but it is obviously a way of knowing that's very important. The next way of knowing is philosophical knowing. Now, what is philosophical knowing? That is knowing that is based on logic and reason And it requires language. Requires language. This is why when I teach something, I like to get straight on the terms, because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with what it is that we're talking about. So when you throw out a word like God, well, what does that mean? Because God may mean something very different to Donna than what it might mean to Grady or what it means to me. So we have to get really clear on our terms. But the thing is, we are also limited in language. You know that in some, I think it's in, it's a group of indigenous people in Alaska that have how many words for snow? Do you know, Stephanie? It's like 40 different words for snow, and each one means something different. So you understand that when it's snowing, sometimes it's powdery, and sometimes it's good for making snowballs. You know, because they live in it, it creates all these different distinctions. So we, on the other hand, are limited because the only word that we use for it is snow. Love is another one of those words, right? We have one word for love. Is loving pizza the same way as loving your husband or your kids? Or loving God? But we have one word, right? So we are limited by our use of language. Our language kind of helps us to define our world. So philosophical knowing is not the end-all be-all, although of course things have to make sense for logically. Well, at least for me they do. There are lots of people who throw their logic out and say, well, this is what I was taught, and they go down that blind faith kind of a road, even though it doesn't make any kind of logical sense, right? Because that's what they were told. They go with the dogma. So, but anyway, that's philosophical knowing. So we know that scientific knowing has its limitations, philosophical knowing has its limitations. The next way that we can know things is intuitive knowing. Now here's where things switch up a little bit. Because when you've got scientific knowing and philosophical knowing, that is objective. That means you and I can be looking at the same thing, we can have a conversation, we can reason something out together. And it can make sense for all of us. When we start getting into these other realms of knowing, they are subjective. So an intuition is something that only Stephanie may have, an intuition that is relevant for her, that I can't tap into her intuition, right? But it is a way of knowing. How many of you have known through intuition? Someone that was calling you, something that was happening, right? We know, and we can't even put it in words because you can't explain it. But it is a way of knowing. And as Einstein said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is the servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Right? Because as a culture right now, we are all about that left brain. It's all about logic. It's all about the materialist, scientific view of things. And that is really what reigns supreme in our culture. You know, and part of it is also, it's if you, not to make a big, huge generality, it's a male-female thing as well, right? Because the male qualities, the male trait is typically logic and reason, right? Whereas the women tend to be more intuitive. So as a culture and as a society, we have smushed down that intuitive thing and made it like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, when actually it is a higher level of knowing than even reason or scientific knowledge. And then finally, the last way of knowing is mystical knowing. Now, not everyone has these experiences or maybe can even identify them as such, because again, it's one of those things that you can't put words to. But there are people who have experiences, let's say someone who has a near-death experience, or someone who has an enlightenment experience, and they have a direct knowing of knowing, and oneness, and connection. And nobody else can see it. Nobody else can explain it. They can't even often explain it. But you know that it has happened because their lives are changed, because they're transformed, because there's no longer any fear. There's no longer that wanting to hurt others or hurt themselves. They understand the underlying fabric of the universe and that we're all one. And sometimes I've had mystical experiences. I was with John Waterhouse yesterday, who is, I don't know what his title is anymore. He's one of the high ups, the field leader. That's what he is. Field leader for Centers of Spiritual Living. He's one of the grand poobahs. Okay. And he was at graduation ceremony that we were at yesterday. So I was thinking about John, an experience that I had with him. And when I finished up my ministerial training and completed panels, which is an interview process, got all the students who'd passed their exams and their panels, and we were now going to be called Reverend, officially Reverend. And he brought us all together. It was about 25 of us, and stood us in a circle, and we're facing outside, so you and I would be next to each other, and we'd be facing out, and John was in the center of the circle. And he has this giant eagle feather that he uses for ceremonies. And we'd just been through this whole ceremony. We even smoked a pipe. I couldn't tell you what was in it, though. We were in Colorado. We had great conversation. We smoked the pipe. Then we did our ceremony, standing in the circle. And John came in the center with his eagle feather. And he did this very symbolic thing for if we've ever felt like we were held back or tethered in any way, anything holding you back at all. And I can tell you, for years and years and years, I would feel like my life was getting ready to take off. But I felt like I was coasting on a tarmac, like an airplane, just coasting. And then it would stop. It would coast a little bit more, and then it would stop. And I thought, when the heck is this plane, this thing, my life? When is it going to get off the ground? When is this going to happen? So John does the ceremony, and he comes behind me with his eagle feather, and he goes, whoosh. And I'll tell you what, I felt it. I felt a physical, something happened, something shifted. All I can say, mystical experience, because it felt like I got shot out of a cannon. And I went from that experience straight into the pulpit here, and I still feel like I'm flying. Because it really was this sense of just, it's taking off. I'm finally doing what I came here to do, and I can't explain it. I can't tell you it was not a physical thing, but I felt it. And none of you can tell me I didn't. And you won't, right? So I love to think, that we've all had these experiences. For some people, it's in nature. Do you ever look at something that's really beautiful? It just takes your breath away. It takes the words. The tears are flowing, right? When you see a new baby, my gosh, we've got a new baby in the room. I don't know how many of you noticed. Yes, the miraculous things that happen. And we discount that, right? Because society discounts it, because nobody else can experience what you're experiencing in that moment. It is an inner knowing, absolutely an inner knowing, an experience that only you can have, and do not ever discount it. Don't discount your intuition. Do not discount your inner knowing. That was, for me, great aha moment. Because my intuition is very often on target, very, very often on target. And years ago, I used to say, well, I guess it's not really what I think it is, because I couldn't explain it. I couldn't put words to it. I'm seeing lots of nodding, so you all understand what I'm talking about, right? So this is, let me just tell you, whenever somebody proposes something to you, when somebody makes a suggestion to you about what you ought to believe about this, that, or the other, you need to put it through all of those 4 ways of knowing, right? Does it measure up to your observation? Does it make sense for you logically? Reasonably, does it make sense? Oh, another example about that. Talking about the tacking with the sailboat, right? Reason and knowledge would tell you that you cannot sail into a headwind. But as we learned last week, the week before, you can do that. We actually can sail into a headwind. I got myself off track there. Ooh, squirrel. Oh my goodness. So the bottom line for me anyway, is that this teaching, beyond just this thing of science and religion, which seems like a very surface kind of a thing, really is very, Very powerful. Very powerful. Example after example after example. We don't tell you what to think here. We teach you how to think for yourself. And don't ever take what I say for gospel, that's what you have to believe. Take it home and experiment with it yourself. Try it out. This teaching has the power to change the world. It really does. When people can grasp these ideas and understand that we are, in actuality, all connected. And what I do to you and what you do to me and what happens in Orlando, it makes a difference for all of us. We're all in this together. We're gonna sing together, we're gonna swim together, one or the other. Right? We are all in this together. And so I want to read to you something from Living the Science of Mind. I want to leave you with this idea before we do our affirmation. What year was this written, Gail? Do you remember Living the Science of Mind?
It is a compilation of all of the essays that come through this magazine.
Okay. So in the 60s, Ernest Holmes was doing his teaching in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So I want to read some of this to you because I think it's remarkable, the insight that came out of this man and what is in this teaching, inherent in this teaching. True religion, true science, and true common sense should go hand in hand, together with that other subtle something which is the essence of feeling, that which is beyond words. It is not always easy in a world of confusion, superstition, and unbelief to maintain an independent position of your own thought. A position that's based on the common sense that Jesus had, that life cannot produce death, that the universe holds nothing against us, and that the gift of heaven is eternally made, but still must be received. Again, this idea of oneness, it's there whether you experience it or not. What we're here to learn together, the tools that we get here, is how to release all of that keeps us from seeing the reality that is there in front of us. Science is helping us to receive this gift. All the comforts and the good that have come to modern life through science are not contradictions of nature, but rather they are affirmations of the limited resources of life. Wars will cease, not when God decides this for us, but when enough people know that it is no longer desirable and steadfastly maintain that position. From communion with Spirit, man will come to perceive the deeper reality, the broader sharing of the human experience. You and I, we are forerunners in this field, breaking down the barriers of race consciousness, the accumulated effects of these misconceptions and these fears that are in the universe in which we live. When science, common sense, and right philosophy combine, the half-gods will have to go away. Little by little, there will be added to our experience a new body of thought, which ultimately will be projected and expanded into the universal mind. We shall not only be freeing ourselves, but we will be helping to free the whole human race. We will be freeing them from the bondage of fear, from ignorance, from superstition, and from thoughts based on what the past has brought forward. The past is dead, but you and I, we are alive. And this is an inside job. See, the world is not going to change out there until you change in here, in your heart and your mind. No one else can do it for you. That subjective knowing, that subjective mystical experience, that intuition, no one else can do that for you. And the world will not change until we each take responsibility for our own experience and make that change for ourselves. Now, if you would join me in our affirmation and say it with enthusiasm, right, and belief and excitement. I am not bound by the past as I release fear ignorance and superstition, I free myself and humanity to experience the presence of the divine. And so it is. And so